Beneath the golden sun of the Nile, ancient Egypt shone as the crown of civilization. Its towering pyramids, painted tombs, and monumental temples promised eternity for kings and glory for gods. But within the shadows of these achievements lay another Egypt, an Egypt not carved into stone, but etched into the bruised flesh of the enslaved. Female slaves in particular bore the heaviest weight of this empire's progress. Their names are absent from inscriptions, their cries lost in the sands, yet their suffering was as real as the monuments that still stand. To the pharaohs and nobles, these women were not human beings but property, bought, traded, and discarded like livestock. They wove linens, carried water, prepared food, and bore children who might never know freedom. Their value was measured not by their will or dreams, but by their obedience. And when obedience faltered, punishment awaited with cruel precision. The brutality they faced was not hidden behind palace walls alone. In workshops, fields, and temples, the whip cracked across their backs as a reminder. They were bound, body and soul, to their masters. If history celebrates Egypt's splendor, it too must reckon with the unspoken torment of the countless women who lived and died as slaves, punished for even the smallest defiance. Yet their stories rarely appear in the hieroglyphs that line temple walls. The scribes recorded victories in battle, offerings to the gods, and royal lineages, but they did not write of the slave girl dragged by chains through a market, or the young mother separated from her child as punishment for disobedience. These silences are deliberate, for acknowledging them would stain the polished image of Egyptian greatness. Still, through fragments, legal texts, ancient complaints, scattered accounts, we glimpse their fate. Their lives were shackled by fear, their bodies a canvas of scars. Egypt's grandeur demanded sacrifice, and the enslaved bore it silently. The contrast is haunting, a world praised for wisdom and artistry, yet maintained through cruelty inflicted on its most vulnerable. And so, before we marvel at the pyramids, we must first ask, whose hands built them? Whose tears watered the soil of empire? And whose broken bodies paid the price of Egypt's glory? Their pain was daily, ordinary, and unending. But punishment in Egypt was not always private. It was also public, theatrical, and terrifying. To truly understand, we must step closer into the instruments of torment that ruled their lives. The most common punishments for enslaved women in ancient Egypt were as brutal as they were routine. A single mistake, dropping a jug of water, failing to complete a task, or showing hesitation, could bring swift retribution. The whip was the master's first weapon. Crafted from strips of leather or reeds hardened in the sun, it tore flesh with every strike. Scars did not fade, they accumulated, a permanent record of obedience carved into the skin. To live enslaved was to wear your punishment across your body, a story written in pain. But the whip alone was not enough to instill fear. Shackles of iron or bronze fastened around wrists and ankles turned women into prisoners even within the spaces they worked. Some were forced to labor in chains, their movements slow and agonizing, ensuring humiliation as well as exhaustion. For the overseers, the clanging of shackles was music. It meant power was intact, control unbroken. Branding was perhaps the most horrifying of all. A heated iron pressed against the skin marked a slave permanently, a living seal of ownership. Unlike scars from whippings, brands could not be explained away as accidents. They screamed identity. This woman is property, and defiance will follow her body forever. Branding also served another purpose. It was a public warning. Those who bore the marks became moving reminders of the consequences of disobedience. Punishment in Egypt was not simply about retribution, it was about spectacle, even in its smallest forms. An overseer might choose to whip a slave girl in front of others, ensuring her screams became a lesson for all. Shame and fear intertwined until submission seemed the only path to survival. For women, humiliation added another layer of torment. To be beaten publicly stripped them not only of dignity, but of the fragile bonds of community, leaving them isolated even among fellow sufferers. The cruelty extended beyond physical suffering. Imagine the despair of a young woman chained overnight in a dark storeroom, her body aching, her spirit broken, hearing the faint laughter of her masters in the distance. She was not just punished, she was reminded of her absolute invisibility in a society that exalted queens and goddesses, yet denied enslaved women even the right to be human. These daily torments created an atmosphere where hope was crushed before it could grow, Every lash, every iron cuff, every seared mark was a message. Resistance is futile. Survival is your only task. And yet, history tells us that even in this atmosphere of fear, some women resisted, quietly, subtly, by holding on to fragments of identity and memory. Their scars, though meant to silence, became silent witnesses of a cruelty that history itself tried to erase. Still, these punishments were only the beginning. Behind closed doors, within the opulent walls of royal palaces and harems, another world of torment unfolded. A world where the punishments inflicted upon enslaved women reached depths that went far beyond the lash or the chain. If whips and shackles ruled the fields, the palace harem was a different kind of prison. From the outside, it appeared as a place of luxury, fine perfumes, silken garments, and women surrounded by jewels. But beneath this facade lay one of the darkest realities of ancient Egypt, the enslavement and punishment of women whose bodies were not their own. The harem existed to serve the desires and ambitions of pharaohs and nobles. Enslaved women were brought here as concubines, attendants, and entertainers. They lived under constant surveillance, stripped of freedom, their worth measured by beauty, fertility, and obedience. And when obedience faltered, punishment followed with a cruelty sharpened by secrecy. Isolation was one of the harshest methods. A woman who disobeyed could be locked away for days in small, airless chambers, starved of light and companionship. Hunger was another weapon. Meals withheld, water rationed, leaving her body weak, but her spirit broken even faster. To the masters, these punishments were not excessive. They were necessary tools of control. Humiliation played a central role. The shaving of a woman's head was both symbolic and devastating. In Egyptian culture, hair was tied to beauty, femininity, and status. To strip it away was to strip her identity, branding her with shame visible to all. A shaven head marked her as disobedient, a warning to others within the harem: resist, and you too will be unmade. But the cruelties reached further. Records and oral traditions suggest that some enslaved women were forced into abortions, their pregnancies deemed inconvenient to the order of the palace. Their bodies were manipulated as extensions of the state, their fertility controlled not by their will, but by the demands of politics and power. For these women, even motherhood, a sacred role in Egyptian culture, was twisted into a site of punishment. Mutilation, though rarer, was not absent. A slave who attempted escape or betrayed the harem's secrets could suffer the loss of fingers, ears, or worse. These acts were not just punishments, they were statements of ownership. A mutilated body reminded everyone that Pharaoh's reach extended into flesh itself, leaving no space for rebellion. Silence surrounded these cruelties. The harem was sealed from the outside world, and what happened within its walls rarely reached the inscriptions of scribes. This silence was deliberate. To acknowledge the suffering of enslaved women inside royal households would tarnish the image of Pharaoh's divine perfection. Yet behind closed doors, the suffering was real, intimate, and relentless. The tragedy of the harem lies not only in the punishments inflicted, but in the invisibility of its victims. Their lives were erased twice, first by their masters, who reduced them to instruments of pleasure and politics, and second by history, which chose to remember queens and consorts, but not the countless unnamed women who endured in their shadows. The cruelty of the harem reminds us that slavery was not only about labor, it was about domination of every human aspect: body, mind, and soul. And while the harem's punishments were hidden, other forms of torment were displayed for all to see. For in Egypt, punishment could also become spectacle, a performance of pain staged to terrify the masses. Egyptian punishment was not always hidden in shadows. Sometimes it was dragged into the blazing sun, transformed into a performance meant to frighten as much as it was to destroy. For enslaved women, public punishments were not only about discipline, they were about making their suffering an example to every eye that watched. The market square was often the stage. A woman accused of disobedience or theft could be stripped, bound, and flogged before a gathering of merchants and citizens. Each lash of the whip was not just for her, it was for the crowd. Her body became a warning. Obedience was survival. Defiance meant torment. The pain was amplified by humiliation, as her suffering unfolded before strangers who stared, jeered, or turned away in uneasy silence. Execution, though less frequent, was the ultimate spectacle. Inscriptions and later records suggest that enslaved women could be sentenced to death for attempted escape, betrayal, or even accusations of poisoning their masters. They might be drowned in the Nile, strangled before witnesses, or impaled outside city gates. These deaths were not quiet acts of punishment. They were staged rituals of power, reminding all that Pharaoh's rule extended into life and death itself. In some cases, punishments blurred the line between execution and torture. A woman might be paraded through the streets in chains, her shaved head glistening under the sun, before being beaten or killed. The act was theatrical, a carefully constructed display meant to terrify other slaves into submission. Pharaoh's authority was not questioned when it was painted across the broken bodies of the enslaved. This spectacle of pain finds echoes in later civilizations. Rome's amphitheaters turned execution into entertainment, but Egypt, centuries earlier, had already recognized the value of public suffering. For them, cruelty was not entertainment, but enforcement. To terrify the enslaved was to prevent rebellion, to sustain order without needing constant war. And yet, there is a haunting similarity. In both Egypt and Rome, the suffering of enslaved women became something larger than punishment. It became performance. The body of a slave girl, trembling in the marketplace, bleeding beneath the whip, was as much a tool of political control as the monuments or armies. For the enslaved, these spectacles etched terror into memory. They did not need to see the punishment themselves. Hearing the cries, seeing the scars afterward, was enough to bind them in fear. Power was reinforced not only by death, but by the anticipation of death. Still, Egypt did not stand alone in this cruelty. Across the ancient world, punishment of slaves carried the same brutal logic: break the body to bind the spirit. And while Egypt perfected its methods in the markets and palaces, its neighbors too wielded chains, brands, and blood. To understand Egypt fully, we must compare its practices with Greece, Rome, and Mesopotamia, and see how widespread the cruelty of slavery truly was. Egypt is often remembered as the cradle of wisdom, medicine, and monumental architecture. But when we strip away the gold and stone, its punishments for enslaved women were neither unique nor isolated. Across the ancient world, cruelty was a shared language of power. In Mesopotamia, the Code of Hammurabi laid out punishments for slaves with chilling clarity. A disobedient woman could be flogged or mutilated, and if she struck her master, death was often the sentence. Branding and shackling were as common in Babylon as they were along the Nile. Both civilizations understood that a scarred body was the most effective deterrent. Greece, celebrated for democracy and philosophy, was no less brutal. Female slaves in Athens faced beatings and sexual exploitation, their testimony in court admissible only if extracted under torture. To the Greeks, truth and pain were intertwined, and enslaved women paid the price for both. Rome, centuries later, carried cruelty to its most theatrical heights. Public whippings, crucifixions, and forced combat turned punishment into spectacle on a scale Egypt had foreshadowed. Female slaves in Rome, like their Egyptian counterparts, were paraded and humiliated, their suffering fueling the machinery of empire. Where Egypt drowned or flogged, Rome burned and crucified. But the message remained the same: obedience or annihilation. What sets Egypt apart is the silence surrounding these punishments. Rome and Greece left explicit accounts, detailing their brutality almost with pride. Egypt, by contrast, concealed much of its cruelty behind walls of silence. The absence of detail in inscriptions does not mean absence of violence. It means that Pharaoh's image of divine perfection could not be tainted with the blood of the enslaved. The cruelty was there, but it was deliberately unrecorded, leaving us to reconstruct it from fragments. This comparison forces us to reconsider Egypt's legacy. It was not only a land of gods and scholars, but also a land where enslaved women lived in chains, beaten and silenced like those in every corner of the ancient world. Romantic visions of Egypt's wisdom cannot erase the bruises carried by its forgotten. And yet, across all civilizations, a haunting pattern emerges. The bodies of enslaved women became the battleground for power. Whether in Babylon, Athens, Rome, or Thebes, their suffering was systematized, justified, and made invisible. The echoes of their pain resound not only across history, but into the present, where systems of exploitation still find ways to survive. It is here, in the connection between past and present, that Egypt's story takes on its sharpest edge. For though its monuments have endured millennia, so too has the cycle of systemic abuse, which leads us to a difficult but necessary question. Why does this history still matter today? The story of Egypt's enslaved women is not just a relic of the past, it is a mirror. When we trace the scars left on their bodies, we see patterns that stretch across centuries, echoing into our own time. Civilizations rise, empires collapse, but the abuse of vulnerable women has remained a constant shadow in human history. Ancient Egypt tells us this truth with brutal clarity. Its pyramids and temples are celebrated as triumphs of human achievement, yet behind those triumphs were countless unnamed women who lived in fear of punishment. Whipped in the fields, branded as property, silenced in harems, or executed in public, they became the invisible backbone of Egypt's grandeur. Their stories remind us that history is not only about kings and monuments, but also about those whose suffering was deliberately erased. And though we live in a modern world, the echoes are unmistakable. Across the globe, millions of women remain trapped in systems of exploitation, trafficked, abused, denied freedom. The methods may differ, but the logic is hauntingly familiar. Control is maintained through fear, violence, and humiliation. Just as in Egypt, the suffering of women is often hidden, unspoken, or dismissed as the price of power. Why does this matter? Because remembering these women is an act of justice. When history ignores them, we risk repeating the same cycles of cruelty. The erasure of their voices in Egyptian inscriptions mirrors the silencing of vulnerable women today. Their invisibility then warns us of the dangers of turning away now. It also forces us to reconsider what we call civilization. We often define greatness by monuments, armies, or art, but Egypt reveals another truth: that the strength of a society is also measured by how it treats its most powerless. If Egypt could build wonders that still stand thousands of years later, yet also subject women to chains and torture, then progress cannot simply be measured in stone. There is, too, a deeper moral lesson. These punishments, whippings, starvation, mutilation, execution, were designed to erase individuality, to make enslaved women forget who they were. And yet, their very survival is proof of resistance. Even in silence, even in erasure, their existence challenges us to remember them. To speak their story now is to break the silence their masters imposed. We must ask ourselves, when future generations look back on our time, what will they see? Will they see a world that learned from Egypt's shadows, or one that repeated them in new forms? The answer depends on how willing we are to face uncomfortable truths, not only in history, but in our present. The sands of Egypt swallowed the voices of its enslaved women, but history has not erased them completely. Through fragments, scars, and echoes, their story still lingers. They remind us that civilization is not simply about what we build, but about whom we protect. They call us to choose, again and again, between repeating cycles of cruelty or breaking them at last. The pyramids stand as monuments to eternity, but so too does the memory of those who suffered in their shadow. If we truly wish to honor history, we must not only marvel at Egypt's greatness, we must also remember the women who paid for it with their lives.